here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the journalist, writer, author Simon Reynolds, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love and poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Has just written a new book called Futuromania, which is also titled Electronic Dreams, Desire Machines and Tomorrow's Music Today. This has just come out April 2024 on White Rabbit Publishing. It's a bit of a page turner, 400 pages, about lots of stuff, mostly about dance music, electronic music, etc. Anyway, this is the interview, so you'll find out more about the book and other bits and pieces. So after several minutes of interest and slightly casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject, the were the kind of early formative years. Simon, it's over to you.
I don't know. It's hard to say. Sort of, I love the Beatles, but just through hearing things on the radio. I like the music my parents played, which was musicals. Actually, they had all these recordings of West Side Story and things like that, and they had Sinatra and stuff. But I suppose I like stuff. I don't think I bought any records until I was like 14 or 15. In fact, there was only one record I actually bought before that, and that was the rather embarrassing start to your career as a pop fan. Is I bought the theme from Sting. So I bought I don't know if it was how many years, 80 or 90-year-old piece of music essentially. It's the Entertainer by Scott Joplin, ragtime music.
Yes.
And it was like, I don't know, I think it was Marvin Helmich did it for the film The Sting. I love that, that ragtime. It's very, jaunty. I like to say that it's, it was actually dance music in its day. So,
yes, I know
the black dance music of the 1900s. But it's not like saying my first single was David Bowie or something. It's fairly square. But I like things on the radio. I like ELO. I think I remember ELO was a group I liked. The Diary of Horace Wimp spoke to me as a lonely teenager. But really, the sort of the breakthrough moment where I thought this is a field of action in which all the excitement and danger and big ideas are flying around was punk. My younger brother Tim, brought home the Sex Pistols and Ian Dury, and I was absolutely electrified by the foul language on the records. Really was the initial thing.
Yes,
it seems so shocking and so not what I thought pop music could contain in terms of that level of it was not just the swearing, it was like the whole language, of a song like Anarchy in the UK, or things that Ian Dury did, it was sort of poetic, yet it was subversive, yet it was, irreverent, unruly. It just really grabbed me. So it was the music and the words, actually.
Yes. Well, it was quite exciting because I had a brother who was a bit older, 7 years, and he was into prog rock. So I'd slightly sneaked into his room to listen to a lot of those records and sort of was kind of fascinated with people like, well, it was Yes, Genesis, all that band, but there was people like Vangelis, Patrick Moraz, and Tangerine Dream was sneaking in there as well, which little moments of kind of the future. But then it was kind of, I was only about 12 or 13 at the time, so it was still a little bit odd. And but it was very different because that wasn't certainly on Top of the Pops or any of the Pebble Mill at One. They weren't playing that kind of music anyway. So then, when you got to 16 or 18, did you then hit university and do a 3-year degree course?
Yeah, I went up to university in 1981, I think it was, and yes, I would have been 18 then. And I think my favourite group at that point was Bow Wow Wow. Because I used to obsessed with the Sex Pistols, so I used to follow, follow whatever Johnny Rotten did next. I didn't follow what Glenn Matlock did, or Paul Cook and Steve Jones, lovely geezers though they are, I followed what Johnny Rotten did with Public Image Limited, and I was really into Malcolm McLaren because he had so many ideas. So I, Bow Wow Wow I was very interested in, and then Malcolm McLaren when he did that Buffalo Gals record, I was like, that blew my mind. So
Yes.
yeah, I was, by then I was absolutely obsessed with music, and all the money that I had either went on records or, I bought music papers every week. Well, the Enemy every week, and I would go to concerts as well. Saw.
Yes. So were you getting those famous 7-inch singles that were attached to the front of them? Like there was a great one with a band called, or an artist called, was it Stan Stinsky and the Motorcade sped on?
Starsky, yeah, I did have that. Yeah, I have got that somewhere in a box. Yeah, I did get them. I mean, I think the thing that really grabbed me that the Enemy did was the cassettes. So, C81 cassette was a record cassette I sent off for. When they did it, they did a competition. They wanted people to write about it. And I think I sent off, it was like the winner won something or other, I don't know. And maybe some of them actually got later to write for the Enemy. But, I sent in my response to the tape, never heard anything back.
I think it is, and I won.
But it was a great tape, and it starts with this. I loved Scritti Politti, and then it starts with this the Sweetest Girl, which is like their new pop direction. And I was absolutely floored that this group that was so spiky and angular had done this gorgeous sort of lovers rock kind of pop reggae song. But all the record with that cassette was amazing, and they did a whole bunch of other great cassettes. And they did specialist cassettes in jazz. Some of my favorite jazz ever still is on that. Straight No Chaser, I think it was called.
Yes, actually, yes. I went and bought all of those cassettes, and there was a Kent one, wasn't there? There was a cowboy and western one. There was a brilliant
Soul, yeah.
There was a reggae one. There was a world music one. But they're all behind.
The reggae one was Bushfire. I think I got that. I got the soul one as well. So I had a phase I was really into soul. I was buying all these soul records. I kind of followed the Enemy's lead, really.
That's right. And did you buy the C86 cassette as well?
I didn't. I got it because by then I was working for Melody Maker, so I think I probably did actually buy it. Now I think of it, because later we were in the same building, so you could get the Enemy free. But I think when I first worked for Melody Maker, Enemy was at a different building, and so I probably would have had to buy it and send off for the cassette. I'm not really sure though. I can't really remember. But later, when we were in the same building, I was poking around. I opened a cupboard door, and there was a whole pile of C86 cassettes. This is some years later, and I took a whole bunch of them. And I was like, these will be valuable someday. And then I don't know, 14 years later or something, I looked up on the internet and they were like worthless. So I threw them out. But now they are valuable. Now they are like, valuable artifacts.
This is true, yes. And if you had the vinyl one, you could at least get probably £20 and package and postage. I know you do appear in Neil Taylor's book, don't you? Did you get his book on C86?
I didn't, but he showed me the chapter I was in. Yeah, I had a good conversation with him. It was kind of fun to talk to him about that era, because he was on, obviously on the other paper. So I wouldn't say I didn't have any personal competition with him, I don't think, but there was a rivalry between the two papers, even though they were owned by the same company. There was this sort of rivalry, and the Enemy had put its stamp on that music pretty quick, but I felt they hadn't really explained what it meant. So I kind of did this piece called Younger Than Yesterday that, sort of was like a analysis of that scene as a subculture. And it sort of kind of made my name, really. And there was even a letter about it in the NME, which is bizarre, because I was on Melody Maker. There was a letter saying, why don't we have more bespectacled suits like Simon Reynolds writing for the Enemy?
Yes.
With copies of Roland Barthes in their back pocket, and so I was like, yes.
There you go. So,
But
during the 80s, then, what was your kind of relationship with the sort of dance music scene that had started to develop so much, or the electronic music scene, not the dance music? But yes, how did you
I'd always had
had
an
had you
interest.
embraced it at this stage?
I'd always had an interest in dance music, sort of just through having ears, and you know, you heard things like the Michael Jackson records or whatever, and you're like, this is fantastic. But also the post-punk bands I liked would be going on about how influenced they were by funk, and you know, and they were trying to sound like Nile Rodgers and Chic, or doing slap bass. You know, this was a big thing. So it was logical to start buying that music. And I bought a lot of. Then when I got to university, I actually did go to there was this big street market, and they had all these stores selling old records, and I used to buy up old disco and funk records from really just a few years earlier. You know, or sometimes like the Fatback Band from the early 70s, but like Donna Summer records. So I like that stuff, and I did a bit of DJing. My friend David Stubbs was like a proper DJ and bought imports, and so I would tape all these New York club imports. So yeah, me and another friend, we did some DJing, not proper DJing, but like playing dance
Yes.
music. So it's always like an interest. But the thing that put me off clubs really was that I'm not really a style person. And in the 80s it was very style oriented, and you always felt like if you went to a club, people would be like, you might not get in, or these people would be like looking at you like, what awful trousers you're wearing.
Yes.
So I kind of didn't like that element, the sort of the nightclub in crowd sort of ethos, and the cocktails and the sort of that vibe. But I liked a lot of the music, so it was a bit of a odd thing. I
Yes,
did write. I did write.
I found nightclubs terrifying in the 80s. It was like I was going to get found out and laughed at, so I just avoided them and
Yeah.
embraced indie pop with great affection. So there you go. So then, yeah. So coming back to the book, so when did 8 years ago you did your one on glam rock, which was
Mm.
fantastic success, a brilliant chapter on Slade, which we all love so much, and obviously was a massive part of my life. But then, yes, bringing this, it's a compilation of different writings that you've had over the decades. So when did this idea come about?
Um, it's got rather a convoluted publishing history. It sort of started with an idea in Italy that someone proposed to me, and then the publisher I'm with there didn't want me to do it for this other place. So we came up with this idea of a collection of writings on electronic music. And initially it had quite a lot of avant-garde electronic music, which is sort of interest and passion of mine, really. And then it came out in Germany and changed a bit. And then my publisher, Lee Braxton at White Rabbit, was interested in the idea of doing it, but he kind of felt it should be fairly focused on popular music. And I think it makes sense. And so we kind of retooled it for the UK, and it is a in my mind, I think I came up with this title Futuromania because at one point I had an idea of doing a kind of book that was not exactly a retraction or even corrective to Retromania's gloomy outlook, but that's just the other side of my, the positive side of me being obsessed with musical futurism. And I was thinking of maybe doing like an all new book, but I realized I'd discussed these ideas in all these pieces I'd written in a kind of more juicy sort of way, really, than doing it in this sort of semi-scholarly way. So I decided to do this collection and then sort of pull all these themes and like these motifs to do with the idea, but along the way, I'm sort of like, asking the question, like, what's it really mean when we talk about music coming from the
Yes.
future? Because if it's here now, how can it be of the future? And there's various ideas with that. Sometimes music is technologically innovative and it has science fiction themes as well. Sometimes it's technologically innovative, but it doesn't necessarily have that sort of sci-fi baggage. And then you have an example like someone like David Bowie, where his early music, he's got a lot of outer space, sci-fi themes, dystopian themes. The music there is actually relatively conventional in terms of like it's in the Beatles, you know, Elton John zone almost
Yes.
time. And so and then you just get, you know, with Low and those albums, he's really starting to experiment more and do stuff that is cutting edge. But you know, you can have music that is using the latest technology. Like a lot of pop music is using way more advanced technology often than, you know, someone making a club record, because they can afford to use, you know, the latest technology, but they're not necessarily using it to make a record that's about, you know, life in the 22nd century or life on Mars. You know, it might be a love song, or you know, or a song about dancing, but it has, you know, very cutting edge technology involved.
Yes, because are you saying then that the electronic sound is always going to be futuristic, or does it sometimes sound quite dated and think, oh, that is a bit
Well, that's a
different?
paradox that, you know, has emerged because we, you know, it's quite a long history of electronic sound. I mean, if you really want to be historical about it, you know, the first one was the theremin, which was before World War II, and you know, that's the instrument that's also heard on Good Vibrations. You know, it's had this life in pop music.
Yes.
That's got a whining high sound in Good Vibrations. But you know, it was a thing before World War II, and there were people who, I think it was Clara Rockmore, who was like a virtuoso playing the theremin in a concert setting. And then you have the post-war music concrete, and you have Stockhausen and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. So it's quite a history of electronic sound, and at a certain point, you couldn't say really, does it really suggest a future anymore? It's sort of like an old idea of the future. So you get
Yes.
the paradox of the sort of retro future, and it gets all the temporalities all get tangled up.
Well, it's kind of interesting because you've got a big section on that, on your love of science fiction. So would you be saying then that the electronic music is mostly going to always be connected to those authors that you mentioned on that in that chapter?
I
And
don't think so. I mean, I think it has been historically that some of the key figures in this story were influenced by them. You know, like Cabaret Voltaire and Human League loved, you know, J.G. Ballard and Philip K. Dick and these sort of writers. And Gary Newman obviously had this big. I don't know who you read, but I gather that his early albums, at least, are all part of this sort of science fiction world he created. I think he may even have attempted to write a novel. You know, the rape machines and the friends were really electronic, and it's all part of this sort of science fiction. You know, people talk about world building, and he was really world building in the you know, the sense that you know, Tolkien built worlds. Imagine
yes,
video game creators build worlds, you know. But you know, I think there's a lot of electronic music that, you know, a lot of R&B is very quite sonically innovative, but the songs are situated in, you know, traditional pop terrain: love, sex, dancing, heartbreak, those sort of things. And the Human League, actually, when they got big, it was through actually starting to do love songs and songs about dancing, wasn't it? Initially, they were kind of cult band, and they had songs like fantastic songs like "Black Hit of Space," I think it's called, right, where they imagine a song so anonymous and formulaic that it somehow becomes this black hole that sucks up the whole chart. And then, you know, if you look at the lyrics, they've really been reading New Scientist or some popular paperback on black holes, because, you know, you lower the stylus onto the record and it becomes heavier than the weight of Jupiter, you know, because of the gravitational pull of the black hit from space.
yes. Did you find that quite interesting then, that a scene like in Sheffield created such a musical kind of style that was very different to what was happening in Manchester, Bristol, Brighton, Norwich? You know, there was a lot of bands during that time that were pushing the boundaries of sound and not sounding particularly commercial, and weren't even trying to sound particularly commercial. And I know there's a Cherry Red Records kind of collection that came out probably from 1978 to 1986 or something. And you think, oh, there's a definite vibe going on in Sheffield at this stage. But at that point, 79, we had Thatcher come in, then we had the miners' strike and the Falkland War, and then there's this idea that we're all going to be nuked, pretty soon. And if we weren't going to be nuked, we were going to have Chernobyl blow up, and it was all over. So a lot of the artists at that point during the 80s, especially the early 80s, they were mostly unemployed, claiming job seekers allowance, and the future was quite bleak, wasn't it? And that kind of the Sheffield scene reflected a lot of that as well.
Yeah, Sheffield has this sort of thing that it runs right through from the early 70s to the 90s, actually, and beyond, which is this connection to futurism and electronic sound. So, like Roxy Music were hugely popular in Sheffield. I don't know if there was a glam group as such that came out of Sheffield, but that kind of thing was very popular there. And then the people who loved Roxy and went to see Roxy formed bands like the Human League and Cabaret Voltaire. Cabaret Voltaire, were obsessed with Brian Eno in rock, when he was in Roxy Music, and how he played this freaky synthesizer, and he talked in interviews about how you didn't need to be a musician to make interesting records. So they started from that premise, Cabaret Voltaire. You had Clock TVA, you had Human League, and then Heaven 17 breaking off from them, and a bunch of other groups. And then what's interesting, doing this sort of electronic post-punk stuff. Chak was a group, one of my first big interviews. As a young writer was with this sort of post-Cabaret Voltaire band called Chak from Sheffield. And Chak built a studio called Fond Studios in Sheffield, and that became where a lot of the early Sheffield bleep techno records were made.
Right.
So
is that where Ninja Tunes comes from, Sheffield?
I don't know, actually. I thought they were more a London thing.
They might be.
Warp Records, obviously, from Sheffield.
Yes, it's Warp Records. God, I should have known that, shouldn't I, really? Because
it's an industrial city. Then the industry is starting to decline. They've all grown up with the sound of steel mills pounding at night, the forges, the drop hammers, pounding, clanging. They love Roxy, they love Kraftwerk. Devo was a group that's very popular there. So this sort of industrial / post-industrial thing then feeds into the early rave scene, because you have some of these studios, Cabaret Voltaire, still in the town making dance floor records by this point. And also you have these warehouses and old mills and factories, abandoned buildings where people throw raves in the late 80s, early 90s. So you have this unique northern, it's not just Sheffield, it's like the Yorkshire sound, really. They call it bleep. And that was like groups like LFO, Sweet Exorcist, which actually included Richard Kirk from Cabaret Voltaire, Nightmares on Wax. I mean, there were loads of them. And it was just this little golden age of British, the first really British sounding techno was coming from Sheffield and Yorkshire and the East Midlands.
Yes, because one of the chapters towards the back of your book, you bring in some sort of cultural theorists. Is it Frederick Jameson and his postmodernism world? Because you said something about his work. When you look at a radical piece of, say, artwork that was radical then, or radical at that time, when you look at it now, it still gives you that future rush you mentioned, even though we live in a present, moment now where the innovations he has assimilated that artwork. Do you sort of...
They ought to be mundane, and they ought to be something that doesn't have that effect. There's something about, I think, a genuinely new piece of music or a work of art or a book, actually, that when you encounter it in the present, somehow the impact it had at its time is sort of captured in it, and it's not even something where you need to read up on it and read up the background of it to know the context. I really feel like you say you look at like a Picasso painting, you still get how somehow a sense of how abrasive it must have been for people at that time. If you read, a few years ago, I read um, uh, Emma Bovary. Is that what it's called? Yes, by Flaubert, which was a groundbreaking book at its time. It kind of invented sort of the modern realist novel in lots of ways. And I read it, and I actually got a rush from reading it, because, like, even though I've read many books from the 20th century that are based in the same kind of approach, I was like, oh, I could see how, I could feel how shockingly new this was, because it was very sort of sexually frank for its time, and and I think it's the same with music. Like, when you play something like "I Feel Love" by Donna, somehow it still seems like the future, even though it's been imitated and copied, and it's a long time ago now, isn't it? How many years?
Yes, well, yes, absolutely. It's going on for 50 years. So you didn't sort of with that, because I sort of had the other feeling of like nostalgia, thinking because it's now gone, that radical moment has been commercialized and sort of giving some.
You have both. Perhaps there's sort of some in some sense you have both, and a part of the nostalgia is for the idea of something having that kind of explosive, mind-blowing impact. I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, maybe it's a sort of mystical projection of mine. But when I read this thing that Frederick Jameson did, this analysis, I thought, yeah, that's right. Because, well, also the idea I got from it and from reading Flaubert novel is, if you think about things that are regarded as classics, they're always things that were innovative in their own time. Shakespeare, right, was innovative. There's nothing. Everything that's handed down to us as a classic in its own time was doing something new, I think.
Yes, but often the artwork that is that edgy, people go, oh God, if only I was there then. But those people in that scene was probably very small and probably quite bonkers as well, and quite threatening or quite odd, but then with time, everything gets kind of like nicely sanded down, and it's a little bit nicer. And oh yeah, I'd love to have been in, I don't know, Chicago, San Francisco in sort of '67, or hanging out with Andy Warhol in the '60s. But you're thinking, or the Studio 54, but they were all completely coked out of their brains. Their bookkeeping was completely disastrous. They went to jail. It was just absolutely wild. But for some reason, we think, oh God, if only I was there then. And I was thinking, I'm sure 90% of the people would have been running in the opposite direction, go, oh my God, what are these young people into? So I just wondered if even if something that's futuristic at the time then becomes quite nicely sanitized, and it's like, oh, that's safe now, we can go and see the orb, and we know it's not going to be, because I remember the orb at Glastonbury, and was it '92, they were headlining and the whole festival was like pumping in, people were absolutely at their head, and now they're going to be doing a double bill with Dread Zone, and it's all going to be rather nice, and we're all going to have mineral water, and we'll be home by 10, and getting up, doing a 5K run in the morning. But I don't know. I suppose anything becomes sort of sanitized very quickly.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I mean, like, I think going to see gigs now is a lot more comfortable than it was. I remember gigs, like my ears would be hurting for days afterwards. I don't think people knew how to do sound properly, or maybe there are better regulations now about sound levels. And it would be very uncomfortable experience. But you knew you'd been through something. Like, you would go to a show, and especially if you got like in the thick of the crowd and might even mosh a bit, you came home and you felt like you'd been through an experience. Now, when I go to see concerts, it's a lot more sedate and well organized, and there's not that sort of frisson of electric sort of danger, I suppose.
Yes. But if you remember in the 80s, those kind of reggae concerts, seeing, Aswad, Burning Spear, Sly and Robbie, the air was thick with dope, wasn't it? And there would always be someone bringing a 5-year-old along on their shoulders, standing in front of the bass bin, thinking now, I wonder if they're completely deaf. But it was a very different, slightly edgy atmosphere, wasn't there? There was characters you thought you wouldn't want to say, oh, do you want to, kip on my floor tonight? Because you think they'd probably rob me. So it was, but it's. I think you just can't be that age again, whatever happens and whatever. Because Lemmy from Motorhead said, you were 16 once, and the music that he grew up with and loved was Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Eddie
Mm.
Cochran, Elvis, and that was him, and he was aware that that was only going to happen once, and it happens for all of us, doesn't it? That's the music we think's brilliant, and the next
Mm.
generation we struggle with a little bit.
Yeah, usually, yeah. I mean, I think probably in my case, I've managed to sustain an interest in contemporary music a lot longer than would be normal, like well into my late 40s. And then it's sort of now actually I've kind of accepted that most music from today, it just won't, I won't be able to connect with it. I don't know, there's something about the sound of a lot of records, that I just doesn't reach me. I read people writing about hot artists, and I'm like, I don't know what this, I'm not quite understanding why this is so resonant, these particular lyrics or whatever. But every so often I'll hear something that really is still surprising.
Yes.
But
So
I think
when
I've come to terms with the fact that it's not natural. I don't think it would be natural for someone who's 60 as I am to be rapidly keeping up with everything that's cutting edge. I think that's definitely a young person's game. And I think you become this word stolid. You become less capable of being ruffled by things. You're sort of, you kind of know what you're about, and you sort of you're more sort of stable in some sense, in terms of like what you're less less impressible and less impressionable. Whereas when you're young, your identity is being formed, and music's a big part of that, isn't it?
Yes, well, I'm always embarrassed with, I suppose it's people of my age kind of moaning about the Glastonbury lineup as if it's been fantastic in the past, whereas when you look at the lineups in the 80s and 90s, you think, oh, that's not that good at all. I can't believe we used to think that people are weird with their nostalgia because, I don't think
The
that
only,
Van
the only time
Morrison or Robert Cray were that amazing during the 84
I
Glastonbury or
went to
something.
the worst Glastonbury ever, surely, I think. Like it was, I don't know. I was, I think like Suzanne. I mean, I like Suzanne Vega, but she's not like a headlining act
She was the
at
headlining on a
Glastonbury.
Saturday night that was
And
89.
somehow she'd wangle it that this artist who was on the same label as her or something called P.S. Turner was the the warmer act for her. Like, so the number two act on the bill. That's very odd. That takes some chutzpah to go out in front of an audience and 70,000 people
I
when
think
you're
that was I think that was the
unknown, basically.
was
Yeah,
well, there was
yeah.
one then when she headlined on the Saturday and she'd been there'd been a threat to her life.
Oh
Someone was
yeah,
going.
yeah. That's the one I saw. Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
one. She has a big
But
coat on, but because it's kind of underneath the big coat is a bulletproof vest.
and then the rest of it, I didn't have a great time with. Elvis Costello was the next night, and I don't know. But there was a lot of things that weren't terribly exciting on the lineup. But the experience of being there was fantastic, and I think it was '89, so it was like there's this whole thing, like there's this sort of big area where all these different subcultures would be sort of circulating and almost checking each other out. And I was like, oh, man, these people have come from every town. All these sort of freaks and weirdos from every town around the UK have come for this thing, more for the experience rather than any specific band.
Yes.
I thought that was really interesting. And I think it only got stronger and stronger over the years to come.
Yeah, there was a whole sort of scene on the edge of the festival because I remember sort of wandering through certain fields and down certain lanes, and you come across people laying in puddles, and you're thinking, what do you do for the rest of the year? But they just looked absolutely horrendous, and there'd be like someone playing some sort of repetitive beats, and everyone was off the head, and it all seemed very exciting and edgy, as long as you could
Mm.
get home and have a wash on the Monday or Tuesday. But it was good. So look, going back to the book, then you've put it together the music chronologically, haven't you? Even though the pieces have been written in different periods.
Yeah, yeah, I thought that was the sort of logical thing. I mean, it doesn't cover every single electronic thing of note that happened from the mid early 70s through to now, but it covers quite a lot of them. And I had a little bit of thing I didn't want to overlap with the techno rave book I did, Energy Flash, and I've actually, obviously Rip It Up, the Postman book has quite a lot of this kind of thing as well, futuristic stuff. So I had to sort of pick things that, hadn't already appeared, but like still had a sort of narrative. And they're written, some were written back in the 80s, some were written, most of them I think were written in the last 15 years, sort of like Retromania period onwards. And
Yes. And it begins with
so,
Donna Summer's classic, doesn't it? I Feel Love, which you
yeah,
go into phenomenal detail actually with the two characters behind this song, which is quite fascinating because the writer, you mentioned that he was Charles Dickens. He loved the work of
that's
Charles
it.
Dickens.
Yeah, well, I think there's three people. There's a whole team. There's the whole Moroder team, of which, a lot of people deserve credit. But the sort of core of it really is Giorgio Moroder, who's like the boss, has the total vision, and then his songwriting and producing partner Pete Bellotti, an English guy who was like a really obsessed with literature and read things like the Mervyn Peake Gormenghast trilogy and uh, whoever it is who did a dance to the music of time. I've forgotten their name, but it's like a 12-volume novel saga. And so from that, he got this idea. He did a record with Donna Summer called A Love Trilogy, inspired by the Gormenghast trilogy, just the idea of a trilogy.
Yes.
And then with this record, I remember yesterday, the idea was each song would be a different era of pop music. So you have a Motown type song, a funk song, I have a 1940s type song, with a disco beat. And then just as an afterthought, they said, well, let's do a song for the future. And that's really where the whole idea of an all electronic dance song came from, and I Feel Love, which was really, they didn't think anything of it. They just didn't even think it would be a single. But then the third element is, Donna Summer herself is a big part of it. The whole feeling of the song, as much as it's all electronic and has its remorseless machine music feel, she does this amazing floaty vocal. And that's based on where she was at that precise moment in time, which is she was madly in love. And I think she co-wrote the lyrics with Pete Bellotti. And she'd never really done that before, but she wanted to write a song because she was so head over heels in love. And the night that they wrote the lyrics, she was on the phone for hours talking to an astrologer because she wanted to confirm with the astrologer that this person she'd fallen in love with, this musician in her backing band, was the right man for her. And after this intense hours and hours of back and forth with this person who did her horoscope, this astrologer, it was determined that the star signs were aligned and this was the man for her. And they did actually get married and live together for the rest of her life.
Yes,
so she was in this absolute swoony state of head over heels in love, and that's the feeling she gives in the vocal, which is a huge part of why the song is so entrancing, I think.
Yes, because actually, when you were mentioning that, he came to Norwich last year. I did an interview. His name's Bruce, isn't it?
Oh, yes, Bruce Sedano, I think, right?
I think he's now sort of cracking a solo career and
Right.
sort of doing some dates. And I thought, blimey, you were married to Donna Summer. So yes, it must have been, well, the stars were right. It did sort of all work well. Because on sort of, there's another bit you've got on this, which is a bit of a shorter chapter, which is dub reggae with Keith Hudson and Creation Rebel and Dub Syndicate as well. So with this, would you say this is kind of futuristic as well, kind of, the reggae dub sound?
Well, it isn't. Actually, it isn't so much futuristic. I include it because it's such a sort of, dub is such a radical and influential form of music based around using technology. It's really creative way, echo and reverb and phasing and this sort of thing of making almost erasing half the song and making the voice into this sort of ghostly. Well, any instrument, the drums as well. Every instrument is kind of susceptible to sort of disappearing and then reappearing. So it's like listening to a hallucinatory, sort of psychedelic, It is futuristic. I mean, it's futuristic in the sense of like something you've never heard before, but it's not like going on about outer space or the 21st century. If anything, it's got a weird nostalgia to it because it's, you know, all about dub is really mostly originally linked to Rastafarianism. You know, it's the other side of the coin of all the roots reggae at that time, and that's a lot of that's about like going back to Africa and the Bible and, you know, all this sort of mythology and so the idea of antiquity and the return of the lost tribe kind of thing is part of this sort of mythos.
Yes, it's probably more to do with Earth magic than it would be spaceships that we were getting
But
excited
you did have,
by.
you know, like Creation Rebel did a thing. I think one of the records no, it's a different record. I think they do a record called something like Spaceship Africa or something like that, like which is like really far out. That's Adrian Sherwood producing, and it's really far out experimental dub reggae where it's full of just mad sounds and you know, it's hard to imagine actually being played at a sound system.
Yes,
So
because actually one of you know, talking of kind of
Starship
vaguely. But talking of kind of fantastic gigs, I remember seeing George Clinton and Funkadelic once many decades ago. I mean, they bring in, you know, their sound is just kind of psychedelic rock funk, but it's very much dressed up into this Starship Enterprise kind of world, isn't it? But how do you sort of view that kind of work in terms of sort of future sound, or is it much more actually this is not part of
no, it is. I didn't really have a piece to deal with it except like you know, like I reviewed a book by a very interesting book by this guy called John Corbett. But it was like one of those sort of book reviews where I didn't really, it was kind of a passive bit of writing. I was just more or less explaining what his ideas were. So I didn't really want to include that. But, you know, yeah, people talk about Afrofuturism, don't they? They talk about Sun Ra, had that whole thing about I'm from Jupiter. Was it Saturn? I can't remember. I think Saturn. And, no, I actually interviewed Sun Ra. In 1990, I think it was, but it wasn't an interview. It was like an audience. I came in and he monologued for like 2 hours, just nonstop, all this stuff about how he was the ambassador for the omniverse and you know, all this mythological and world he'd created for himself. So Sunrise part of this, Lee Perry with all his stuff about I am the space computer, and then, as you say, George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic had a whole mythos to do with. It's actually rather the thing that Parliament Funkadelic did is actually very similar to Hawkwind's thing, where you have the groovy freaks who have the funky vibe in Parliament's case, or like tuned into the cosmos with Hawkwind. Yes. And then you have this sort of negative, the dark force, which is there's people, you know, in Parliament Funkadelic, there's a character called Sir Nose devoid of funk. So like the dirt is like in a name like Darcy, you know, Sir Nose devoid of funk. It's like he's a guy who's like he represents sort of WASP, you know, like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant uptype, you know, and so he's the enemy of all funk. And in the Funkadelic mythos, it goes through many stages. But at one point, they had this thing called a bop gun, which is like a sort of gun that fights the people who have no funk, sort of funkifies them. But you know, it's totally comes from science fiction and comic strips and cartoons and you know, they're sort of like presenting themselves as superheroes, you know, bringing the funk to liberate mankind.
And science, because obviously you know mentioned that you've got this big passion of science fiction, which obviously runs through a lot of those kind of ideas. But then you've got this chapter on synth Britain, don't you? Which is which is kind of an interesting one, because obviously this is where the technology is at its forefront, and this is where it feels very edgy at this stage on the musical map, because this is music that no one's ever particularly sort of made before. So I think this does feel like of its time, doesn't it?
The piece on synthpop, the Guardian asked me to write something about it because Synth Britannia was just about to be shown, and I was actually in it. I was actually the only talking head who wasn't a musician. So I was happy to write this piece, talking about Britain's contribution to synth pop. But this is a program. Synth Britannia has been shown. It must have been shown about 20 times, and every time it's re-shown, I'm like, I really should have asked them for some money. Because I contribute quite a lot to this program. I'm like the intellectual spine of it, I suppose. But it's a really good doc. It's a really good doc about synth pop, and it has great clips of Cabaret Voltaire and Human League and all these people talking about it, and old footage, and it really tells that story well. So in the piece, I wanted to write about this golden age of synth pop that I sort of say starts with Our Friends Electric by Tubeway Army, as they were initially, Gary Newman.
Yes.
And then talk about the Human League and John Fox and Depeche Mode, who initially didn't seem like they would ever be anything much, and then just kind of blossomed into this really serious band, and like huge globally, aren't they, Depeche Mode?
We didn't see that one coming at all, did we? Really? If you could
They
put
spent
money
quite a
on
bit
one of
onto
those,
this, didn't they? Just can't get enough, like your bouncy little teeny bop group, and then
yes. And I think I remember seeing them on the Old Grey Whistle Test, laughing at people like Jimmy Page and Roy Harper, and being quite sort of young and frivolous, and yet there they become these serious musos who we just play one gig in front of 100,000 people, and that's your tour done for the next 5 years. It's amazing, and their fans are so committed. That's the other thing there. But then it's quite interesting because you've got the bit on Euro kind of electro, and that sort of, for me, there's always that element of the right wing creeping in, these kind of slightly fascist sort of vibes to the imagery of some of it, which is quite interesting, isn't it?
it does creep in. I think it is an industrial music thing, and it's probably like Throbbing Gristle explored it a bit and maybe got a bit too close to it at points. There's an interest in sort of extremes of psychology and power, and sometimes the interest in power and control is from the people who are sort of wanting to resist it. But then it becomes this sort of weird fascination with it. But like a lot of the industrial groups were interested in serial killers and psychopaths, and then it's not much of a leap to dictators and people who run concentration camps from that, because that's like psychosis with a uniform on it, and an official power. So this sort of interest in the dark side of human psychology. So it's debatable. Like, why can't artists deal with it? Well, it can, but then sometimes you feel like it's getting into this unsavory zone. And some of the performers in industrial music really flirted with fascism in quite an unwholesome way, and created a sinister sort of energy around them. Attracted a lot of weird, disturbed people, I think, as well.
Yes, I did go and see the Young Gods, and I quite enjoyed the band, but I found some of the audience a little bit like interesting. But where would you put Liebark in all that, by the way? Would you put that as kind of in using comedy?
It's like that thing when they never reveal, they never break character, and they never, it's completely poker faced. And that is like the sort of, like Throbbing Gristle did this song Discipline, and I think they did a song called Subhuman as well, and then it's almost like Liebark sort of said, oh, that's interesting, well, we'll take it to the limit where we actually create an imaginary nation state with its own fascistic-y seeming military stuff, and I think they took it really far. I think they even created their own postage stamps and had a consulate actually in a real country. It's like performance art, but they're playing with ideas of totalitarianism, and obviously coming from the former Yugoslavia. I think they're Slovenian, right?
Yeah, that's right.
They're from this part of the world where all that's very, on the one hand, you've had kind of communist rule for a lot of their era, but then that collapses, and then something quite ugly rears up, which is this ultra nationalist thing, and all the sort of, Yugoslavia was able to keep all these people's peace, but then when it collapsed, all these ancient ethnic rivalries came out. So this is sort of like the backdrop for this imagery they're playing with. But they've kept it up. They kept it up for like decades. And every so often they did an album about where they did covers of national anthems.
Yes, well, I know they did a Jesus Christ Superstar, and they've done The Sound of Music, and then I have a certain love of the band because they do great songs and they do some great covers, and I kind of
The thing I loved that they did recently was they covered The Lonely Goatherd from Sound of Music. It's hilarious, and they made it sort of vaguely creepy in the video, certainly.
Yes,
but they it's interesting. They're playing. When they do these covers of rock songs, like songs by Queen or whatever, they're bringing out a sort of, fascisty subtext that's kind of in a lot of, stadium rock anyway, like where you have a huge mass of people all looking one direction, behaving the same, and these sort of, bands start gesturing in this kind of vague, let's say authoritarian way. That the energy can be a little unsettling. A lot of early rock critics who were used to rock being like coming out of small clubs and medium-sized halls, when it became stadium music, they found it very alarming and disturbing, and they felt that bands like Led Zeppelin created this sort of Sturm und Drang, this sort of Wagnerian vibe.
Yes, well, absolutely.
Queen, were criticised for that as well.
Well, yeah, and just kind of last one, because it's kind of the chapter and some of the albums I particularly loved during the late 80s. There was a guy called, I think, DJ Fast Eddie on, and there was Tyree Acids Over, and you've got a nice bit on this kind of on Future, spelt PH, isn't it really? This is where the acid house sound is really different again. So when did you sort of embrace that musical style when it happened?
I liked quite a bit of house music. I wasn't really going clubbing to it, but I liked there was this outfit called Nitro Deluxe who did this song, This Brutal House. That was actually a hit in the UK, and various other things, Todd Terry, early tracks by him.
Weekend.
But then when I heard about this thing, the music I was really excited about in the late 80s was sort of the new psychedelic rock, My Bloody Valentine and Butthole Surfers. And then I heard this thing called Acid House. I was like, what? That must be amazing. Acid House. That's like, it's house music. It's in clubs, but it's trippy and psychedelic. I've got to investigate. And so I got a trip out to America to do, I can't remember who, maybe it was the Pixies or something, but then London Records paid for me to go from New York to Chicago. Unfortunately, they sent me on a day when all the top DJs and producers were out of town, or there were no clubs or something. I don't know. Anyway, I couldn't get to speak to hardly anyone, but I did speak to this guy Tyree, who was very nice, and told me about how his next direction was going to be blending hip hop and house music, which is what he actually became famous for, I think. But right at that point of this early '88, he had just done a track called Acid Over, like a real serious acid house track. And I found that mind-blowing. It was nothing like what I thought, acid house would be. I imagined something much more, like psychedelic music in the 60s, like, more maximal. And then acid house was so minimal and so like alien and like, do you know the episode of Star Trek where they're trying to brainwash someone who's a criminal, like cure them of being a criminal or something. It was like a punishment, I think.
Right.
Put them in a brainwashing machine, and this sort of, I can't remember if they actually have electronic music, but like, they're kind of, it's horrible. They're like completely in a catatonic state. And that's what I felt like acid house was like you would just be like a zombie kind of tripping out to it, which is not actually that far from what it was like in acid house raves, except people were a bit more energetic, doing the mad hand movements to it. So I really liked it as music, and I didn't get involved in the rave scene until a few years later. But I bought the records. I wrote about, and then I started writing about 808 State and people like that. The British people.
And there was people like Adamski. They did an album called Live and Direct, or
Yeah, and then he did Killer, which I thought was fantastic. I think I did a cover story, or certainly had a huge piece on Adamski. It's an exciting time because there was all the original great stuff from Chicago and Detroit and New York, and then you started to get this British sort of version of it, and you had all these people: Baby Ford, 808 State, Orbital.
but you had a guy called Gerald.
A guy called Joe was fantastic. Voodoo Ray was like just amazing track, and then he became a really cool sort of jungle producer. I don't know. There was all the stuff from Sheffield we talked about before, LFO, and the Orb was sort of part of it as well. Even though it was slow and not really. It was a different vibe. It was kind of dubby. They were sort of part of this whole explosion of British psychedelic tinged dance music.
Yeah, so you had KLF, who did a couple of ambient records, one which was called Space, and another one which was, I think, a train journey
Chill
through.
out. Yeah.
So that
and they
was
sampled Acker Bilk, and sort of Elvis Presley and stuff. Yeah, that they did that. That's sort of become a classic. And then they were really good as just a pop band doing this sort of absurdist pop and getting Tammy Wynette to be on top of the pops doing a house record, and it's just a fantastic time. There's so much great music that came out then, and you had Delight. They had Delight, Crystal Waters. You had all this stuff in the charts, and then you had the underground scenes that were kind of mutated.
What's always interesting, because then this kind of this electronic music builds up to the kind of the rave the festivals, the outdoor events, and Castle Malton and such places. And when anybody ever does one of these documentaries, which is a little bit of a trippy sort of visual feast of Britain, Arcadia, they often sort of go to these kind of images of young people raving outside, but there is this kind of sense of going back to Arcadia and sort of getting back to nature, but with electronic music, dancing, because you don't need.
Contradiction. It's a total contradiction. But it was the same with the hippies. The hippies had that whole get it. I'm going to get my head together in the country sort of thing. That was, I think, Traffic said that. They went out and lived in a cottage in Berkshire and made their first album. But you had the Woodstock. You had this idea of, we'll take this music into this Edenic summer, beautiful midsummer kind of vibe. But we're also hauling these huge amps and generators to power them. And there's this trippy lighting show, and we're taking drugs that are often synthesized. So it's a weird sort of contradiction, which rave just intensified, because it's very, very. The music was supremely technological and depended largely on technology made in Japan, cutting edge.
Yes.
Hardware music, like the Roland 303, the Roland 808 drum machine, the Roland 909 drum machine, I think, is the house music one. So it's it's completely. I guess it's like a fantasy of escaping modernity, but bringing some of the elements.
Well, I think with bands like Beloved, Sunrising, there was this kind of element of dancing, being quite shamanic, getting into these altered states, obviously having drugs, and then sort of watching the sunrise and connecting with the great universe and Mother Nature. So it is brilliantly contradictory, really.
And there's it's very modern, but the vocal bit in the Sunrising is sampled from a record called Gothic Voices, which is actually based on medieval religious music composed by this woman, the abbess Hildegard of Bingen, who was like a sort of scientist, and she was an abbess, like a priest, female priest, head of a nunnery, but she was also a scientist and a composer. And she composed this, she had visions, and she kind of made this mystical church music. So there's this sort of, there's this sort of weird timelessness thing, or going back to the past, blended with the very modern technology and modern drugs.
Yes, my God. Because you do mention, I think, in nearly your last chapter, the one about, was it Gregory Coleman, this track called Amen?
Yeah, yeah.
And this has been sampled at some.
Thousands of time. Yeah, I mean, I think it was originally like it was a break that was discovered during the hip hop era of crate digging, and one of the really famous uses of it is in a track by Mantronics, who was a group I loved in the mid '80s, and so that's where a lot of the jungle people, they didn't get it directly from the original record, they got it from this Mantronics track. I think it's called King of the Beat.
Yes.
And originally, though, it was like recorded in 1969. It's this group. It's like a funk gospel group, and a bit like I Feel Love. It was just a throwaway track. It was the last track of their album. It was a B-side, put out on the B-side of a single, but it has this really good drum break in it. It's an instrumental, and then there's this bit where just Gregory Coleman just lets rip, and the break. There's hundreds of breaks, but this one had a particular quality that the jungle people liked. It's pretty up tempo. It had a kind of sort of almost military feel, and it's got this sort of great sort of snare cracks in it, and then this splashy. I'm not sure it's hi-hats or a ride cymbal, but like it's this splashy sound. So when they started to loop it and chop it up and do stuff to it, these sort of sonic properties kind of were magnified, and it just became a sound of incredible urgency and energy, and it sort of fit this vibe that jungle had, which was
Yes.
sort of renegade music, almost military music in a weird way.
I remember John Peel enjoying happy hardcore during that 90s period,
Yeah,
with great enthusiasm. It wasn't very sophisticated, but it was a lot of fun, actually. It was interesting you mentioned Mantronics, because that was a sound that was definitely felt very new, and the fact that they could rhyme ladies and Mercedes so easily was just
yeah. I mean,
yes.
that was. I think that was all based around drum machines. Oh no, well, obviously, if you used they used the Amen break, then it wasn't. They must have used some break beats, but a lot of it was drum machines and just expertly programmed. So they were really funky, yet also really robotic at the same time. It's this brilliant thing that the sort of early electro hip hop people could do, where it's mechanical sounding because it's a drum machine, but they kind of syncopate it and have all these amazing little um, jitters in the beat.
Yes, no, I thought Mantronics was stunning. I thought they had a really interesting sound to them, and that was probably sort of quite mid-80s. I think they were at the UK Fresh, weren't they, Mantronics?
Yeah, they were headliners, I think, weren't
There
they?
was
I
There was
interviewed him.
Grandmaster Flash, African Bambaataa, and just a whole load of other people. I can't remember who else.
It was really amazing. Yeah, I think I interviewed Mantronics, and he had this whole thing. Like often musicians have sort of their heroes in their heads, or that they sort of almost get into a rivalry with. And so he had this whole thing about Trevor Horn, and it was partly. I mean, I'm sure he liked Frankie Goes to Hollywood, but I think it was mainly the Art of Noise records. And he was going like, I'm working on stuff that Trevor wouldn't even understand. It was like this, just it only in his own head was this sort of, I'm gonna outdo the master, which I think he did with the Mantronics records. Amazing.
Yes, well, no, it's interesting. Well, look, this has been fantastic. Thank you ever so much for this, Simon. It's been great, and
Yeah, really good
I've,
fun. Yeah.
it's been, yes, it's great to sort of get through it and see. We didn't have to talk about Stump, Big Flame, Close Lobsters at all, did we? But it was nice. It's nice to think that during that period there was all this other period, and it was all very
Yeah.
of its
Yeah,
time.
I was writing, while I sort of wrote quite a bit about hip hop back then, and then later dance music, but I was also equally excited by what was coming out of, for want of a better word, the indie scene. Stump, you mentioned Stump, they were one of the first interviews I did, and they were just about the most entertaining band around at that time. I think Mick Lynch was a really great stage performer, wasn't he?
And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview, apart from the last few seconds of casual goodbyes. But anyway, massive thank you to Simon Reynolds for giving me the time for that interview. The book is out, available from all good bookshops and also online. If you want to contact me at C86 Show, you can just Google C86 Show on, I suppose, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You will be able to find me and send a message if you fancy something nice, obviously. Anyway, all these interviews have been archived, so you can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.